So hi Dan and Sophie, I'm Richard Eldred. I'm the site director of Gorse Industrial Estate and previously known as number 94 maintenance unit when it was a storage facility for the UK's, possibly Europe's first nuclear weapons, the Blue Danube. And that was between about 1954 to 63. We're currently an active industrial estate, but after close collaboration with Historic England and English Heritage, we've also preserved a lot of the Cold War history, and I'm very happy to show you Sophie and Dan around today.
Hi mate, so how many acres of land have we're talking about here?
So it's a 23 acre site, and we're on the edge of what was and still is called RAF Barnham. So it was an established area for the military back from the First World War.
Are both sites interlinked then?
They were. When we were a nuclear storage facility, there was an inner road that ran between RAF Barnham and the bottom of our driveway. So personnel which worked here and lived and slept at the RAF Barnham site were able to travel between the two without going onto public roads.
We noticed that obviously when we're looking around later, that obviously everything's some of the site has actually been repurposed and it's been taken over by yourselves, and obviously a lot of it is just being left in incredible condition. So spoke about with in conjunction with English Heritage. I mean, let's talk about the site in terms of what is original and what's been
Okay, so when I show you around, all the buildings you see are original from the 1950s nuclear storage use. We lost one building to a fire in the 80s and another building was damaged in the 90s but restored to look exactly as it was. So it was one of the aspects of the site that attracted English Heritage to work with my parents to conserve the site, because so much of the site was exactly as it was built in the 1950s.
Talking about how you came across this site with your parents, let's talk about how that all started then.
So it was an unusual set of circumstances and almost a bit of a fluke, if you like. So my parents had worked in Hong Kong in the 60s and they moved back to the UK in 65. They were looking for a local business and a place to live somewhere between their family homes of London and North Yorkshire. And they came to Thetford. They found a property they liked. Dad had noticed that this site had been withdrawn at auction. He went to inquire about it, just out of curiosity. As a result of that inquiry, ended up buying the site in 1966. Originally, they used the site to grow mushrooms, which was a new business venture they embarked on. Was very successful. The mushrooms grew extremely well in the ex-nuclear storage bunkers. Became a big supplier for one of the big national distributors. The mushrooms then unfortunately caught some sort of strange virus, which meant they didn't grow very big. They weren't very profitable. So my parents moved into renting out the space for local businesses. And one of our very first customers, I think, was Comrades, the fashion people, who I understand had a storage facility in Thetford, but due to a fire, needed somewhere else and used my parents' nuclear bunkers for, or nuclear storage sheds for storage, and it went from there. We now rent out to 22 commercial tenants, over 43 units.
So let's take a rewind then. Let's actually start the story in the beginning properly and historically. So what was the actual purpose of this site?
So the purpose of the site was to store the very first nuclear weapons in the UK. And the technology had come from the work done with scientists at Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project. One of the key leading scientists, a chap called William Penny, was commissioned by the Labour government after the war to develop the very first nuclear weapon for Britain. And the very first weapons on development were stored here and at a place called Foldingworth in Lincolnshire. Our site now is still preserved exactly as it was, where I understand Foldingworth has changed quite a lot. So yes, we were the very first bombs. They were airdrop bombs, and they had to design new aeroplanes to do that. The original tests were done in big modified Lancasters, but then they designed the V bombers, the Valiant, the Victor, the Vulcan, and they were stationed at some of the local air bases. So we supplied the bombs for those air bases. So RAF Honington, for example. And I understand, although I'm not a technical aviation expert, that the Valiants were the main V bombers used with the Blue Danube. Interestingly, people often ask, why is it called the Blue Danube? Because it's a waltz or a river, isn't it? The military, the RAF particularly, I think, liked what they call the rainbow codes for weapons, because a random noun and a random colour couldn't logically be decoded or linked to anything. So a lot of, particularly the explosives and many of the early nuclear weapons were named after a colour and a noun. So we have Blue Danube. Another bomb stored here, slightly modified, was the Redbeard. And then it went into other bombs like Blue Streak, Blue Steel, Violet Club, Yellow Sun, Green Bamboo, all these sort of random sounding items which are actually codes for nuclear weapons, the rainbow colours.
So we need to talk about the local rumours of this site.
So this site was built fairly quickly in the sort of early to mid-50s as an add-on to the RAF Barnham site. Apparently, the rumours were mixed and varied as to what the site was used for. Because it was so top secret, there was no official explanation for its use, and certainly asking would have been discouraged. The word on the street was that it could have been used for housing chimpanzees and monkeys for the space program, which, although sounds sort of very far-fetched and laughable now, is maybe not so unusual, because I think the Americans and the Russians had both used animals, a dog and a monkey, as the first living entities, if you like, into space. So I think the word was out that Britain was developing a space program and training monkeys and chimpanzees for that purpose. And they were thought to be housed in the little sheds where, in fact, the nuclear plutonium cores were housed.
So the final question is, in relation to where we are, there's two other specific sites that are sort of tied in with this, namely Orford Ness and Fort Houses. Would you like to talk about those?
So this is some research which I did fairly recently, and I'm certainly not an expert, so apologies if I get any technical information wrong. Key sites for that era were Aldermaston, where there's a lot of top secret nuclear weapons technology was developed. I understand Fort Halstead down in Kent was a key area for developing the explosive sides of things. Orford Ness is where I think there was early sort of radar technology, and also Blue Danube tests were carried out, obviously with casings which were sort of crashed into concrete walls to look at sort of implosion technologies, etc. So a lot of that type of bomb testing was carried out at Orford Ness, and here was actually where the bombs were stored and they were maintained. The early technology was a bit like the early computers, you know, probably a warehouse of computers back in the 50s would fit into your mobile phone today. And I think similar technology applied then, in that the nuclear weapons were very big, very cumbersome. The Blue Danube was approximately 25 foot long, 10,000 pounds, and required regular maintenance and fettling by the scientists. The plutonium and beryllium cores had to be, I think, inspected and I think changed over every 6 months because of the half-life of polonium, and the casings themselves were regularly inspected. We had a building for doing x-rays, and they'd be taken apart and looked at, and then also taken to the various RAF bases locally, and also components I think would go down to other research facilities down in Berkshire and south of us. There was a sister site at Foldingworth in Lincolnshire, and that was for supplying weaponry for the northern V bomber air bases.
Before we end, and you kindly show us around, you've had many an interesting guest visit. Can you tell us any of those fascinating stories?
So we've had over the years certainly some interesting guests. The site was used for an episode of Dad's Army. Dad's Army was filmed very much in this area, and Thetford was one of the primary locations, particularly street scenes for Warmington-on-Sea. Many other scenes for Dad's Army were shot in the Thetford and surrounding areas. The cast and crew used to stay in Thetford at the Bell Hotel and the Anchor. The Thetford Drama Club, which at the time was run by my father, had a close link for supplying extras for Dad's Army. And so we used to watch Dad's Army being filmed when I was very young, about 5 or 6 years old, in our street. And my parents were often in background scenes along with many other local Thetford people who were particularly members of the drama club at the time. So A Face in the Poster was filmed here at Gorse Industrial Estate in the early 70s. We also had an episode of Elo Elo, because I think David Croft, the producer, was local to the area, and they were filmed at Linford Hall, and I think they used one of our watchtowers for a scene of Elo Elo. We were also, I think, briefly featured in Britain by Drone, and also we had a very interesting slot in episode 3 of Fortress Britain, which was on Channel 4 a couple of years ago. We've had lots of interesting visitors come on tours to the site, particularly ex-RAF military police and personnel who worked on the site. And also I was very interested to host a couple of delightful gentlemen who'd been involved in early 1950s testing, and they were able to give a lot of interesting insights to their experiences relative to, you know, the nuclear weapons program at that time. So yes, we've had a lot of very interesting visitors, and there's I think growing interest in Cold War history. So we're happy to be part of that, you know, preservation of that time in history.
Should we take a look around then, mate?
Yeah,
let's do it.
a nice place to start on showing yourselves and your viewers around the site is our replica Blue Danube bomb. This is an exact replica, size and scale of the original. It's about 25 foot long, 10,000 pounds. It was an airburst bomb dropped from the V bombers, typically the Valiants, typically designed to detonate at about 500 to 1,000 feet. It had various mechanisms within it to ensure that it did detonate when required, but there was a fail-safe detonation process. So if it hit the ground, it would detonate on contact, typically so that the bomb didn't fall into enemy hands amongst anything else. The very first testing, they found it was so aerodynamic that when the Valiant pilot dropped the bomb, a following fighter jet who was observing the proceedings informed them rather worryingly that although the pilot had said bombs away, the bomb was still with the plane, following the plane, trapped in a slipstream a couple of feet under the bomb bay. And the pilot had to perform a rather daring manoeuvre to shake the bomb away. After that, apparently, a mechanism was designed into the tail fins, they're not shown on the replica here, which were spring loaded. So on release, I think they were called dragon's teeth, there was like a sort of a baffle which created a turbulence, caused the bomb to shake itself away from the slipstream of the Valiant from which it had just been dropped. So that's quite an interesting anecdote. The capacity of this bomb was 15 kilotons, it's equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Similar in capacity and very similar design to the bomb that the Americans dropped on Nagasaki in the Second World War. Very quickly followed by a bomb called Redbeard, and then beyond Redbeard we started going into rocket technology. I think Blue Steel was an airdrop bomb but it had rockets which could take it up to 70,000 feet and travel 2,000 miles. And then you went into submarine launched nuclear weaponry. And at that point, 1963, this site became obsolete as the technology evolved. And it was decommissioned over 3 years, 63 to 66. And after that, my parents bought it. It's been in commercial use ever since. One thing I mentioned earlier to Dan and Sophie was a question we get asked is, why was it called Blue Danube? Because many people think of Blue Danube as a waltz or a river, and it's because the Allies, the British, had a rainbow system for describing weapons with a noun, a random noun, a random colour. So many of the bombs were called something random, like Blue Danube, Blue Streak, Yellow Sun, Violet Club, Green Bamboo, Red Beard, all secret weaponry, but not logically decoded because of the random noun and random colour. So we're stood at the top of the driveway now, and I'll just tell you a few security features which I'm aware of around the design of the site. When visitors come up the driveway, they'll notice that midway there's a very sharp bend. Everything's designed deliberately on this site, which I think is interesting because when they got the blueprint to build it, there was no other points of reference. It was the first facility of this type that had ever been built in the UK. And I think it's incredible how quickly they designed this site and had it up and running within sort of a couple of years. And they were still adding on to the site over the following few years, particularly around the larger watchtowers. We've got 5 of those. There were originally smaller wooden watchtowers. But coming back to the driveway, the big kink in it was so that if anyone was snooping around at the bottom, they couldn't look right up the driveway into the site. And also, if anyone had come up here to try and ram the gates, for example, as a security breach, they'd have lost all their speed on the sharp bend of the driveway. As we come at the top of the driveway, you hit a new raft of security measures. The rails here were the first of a very big steel gate that was operated at this point, and vehicles would have to wait for that to be opened. They'd then go into the middle section, the gate would be closed behind them, and there were manual gates midway, central ones for vehicles, side gate for pedestrians. Those would be open, they'd pass through, they would be closed, and then just beyond the white Range Rover, there was another big steel gate and a picket post, and pedestrians would go through to the left through the picket office, and vehicles would be let through the steel gate when it was opened. Now, this part of the site and down at the bottom of the driveway is where the generators for the site were, the power for the site, and also the key vehicles. So the convoy vehicles taking the Blue Danube to the RAF bases, and also aspects of the bomb down to research facilities in probably Berkshire, probably Aldermaston. Whether things went to Fort Halstead, quite possibly, I'm not sure. They would be taken in convoys with these Pantechnicons, which were sort of glorified removals vehicles, and motorcycle outriders on Triumph 500s, and also armed personnel in transit vans. So this part of the site, the lower part of the site as it were, was for transport facilities, and also for personnel working with the powerhouses and the generators for the whole site. This section here was the middle section, very secure area. People in the lower site often would have never come into this zone, wouldn't really know what happened up here. It was all on a need-to-know basis. To the right here is a group of buildings where the base commanders and senior personnel who operated the site were based. Over here is where many of the guards were based, the military police, and we'll go over to the back in a moment to show you where the guard dogs were kept. We had about 12 to 15 specially trained RAF guard dogs who are looked after by their specifically trained dog handlers, part of the military police, the RAF military police. Buildings there with the bigger doors is where the site fire engine was. The purpose of the site was to be totally self-contained. Had there been anything wrong, either technically or any sort of breach of security or any risk from fires, it would have all been dealt with by the RAF on site. They wouldn't have wanted any civilian, police, fire or any other contractors to come on the site for any reason, because by that point it was locked down as a top security facility. Go through the final set of gates. So we had steel gates here on a sliding rail, manual gates midway, another set of steel gates on a sliding rail. Once you went into the top site, very few personnel based there. It was mainly for the very top scientific officials who carried out tests and inspections of the weapons, and it was for the storage of the bombs as they awaited to be transported over to RAF bases nearby. Interestingly, we've got storage for 57 weapons here, but there were probably never more than 15 to 20 bombs stored here, purely because there probably wasn't enough uranium to go around to make more than that. Each bomb cost £1 million, which just after the war was a colossal sum of money. So you had 15 to 20 million pounds worth of bombs here, plus the site had cost £2.5 million to build in the early 50s, which is quite extraordinary when you think the country was still on rationing following the Second World War. Okay, so we're in a part of the site now which was heavily used by the guards, the RAF military police. The small building in the foreground here was specifically built to prepare the meat for the guard dogs. The guard dogs were on site 24/7. They lived on site. There were 12 to 15 guard dogs. They were in their kennels, which used to be here. The concrete pad was just in front of the kennels and they were lined up just behind. The RAF police, who were on site 24/7, had several of these buildings allocated for their use. The one behind the meat preparation unit was the dormitory for any guards who were having a rest or sleeping in between shifts. This building in front of us was a slightly later edition, sort of probably 57, 58, which was built as a gymnasium for the on-site guards, because obviously there was fairly limited things to do here other than guard duty. In between shifts, they wanted some sort of recreation. Apparently, there was a football pitch just over the fence there, which they could access via a secure gate. And this building here was the canteen for the guards. The guards were the only personnel kept on site 24/7. All other personnel at the end of shift would go to the bottom of the driveway, through a side gate, through a private relief road, through to the main dormitory for the site, which was RAF Barnham. Okay, so if you want to just follow me, folks, we'll show you a sort of long ways view of this. Was a sterile patch of ground, approximately sort of 30, 40 meters wide, that goes around the entire site. It was laced with tripwires attached to very bright magnesium flares. They were held on steel support spikes, if you like, about so high off the ground, a couple of feet off the ground. They were at that height so any rabbits on site could go underneath without setting them off. Whether or not they were also set high so guard dogs could go underneath if they were chasing an intruder, quite possibly. The magnesium flares were housed in a Bakelite pod with a sort of foil cap, and if they were set off, they gave off an extremely blinding bright light. They weren't a sort of rocket as such. They were a very bright light that would be immediately spotted by patrolling guards and also guards which were based in the watchtowers. The site has a pentagon type shape. So you've got a driveway coming up to a pentagon type shape, and it's similar, I always thought, to the original sort of Napoleonic fort type shapes, and maybe that's where the military planners got the idea for that defensive structure from. The guards which were in the watchtowers, they were on shifts there for about 45 minutes, then they'd switch over with guards which were on foot patrol. That kept everyone sort of fresh and focused and stopped people getting bored or distracted. The whole site was illuminated 24/7 by extremely bright lights which came from these lampposts, which were about every 30-40 yards, plus 2 searchlights in the watchtowers. So it was like day 24/7. The most difficult conditions for security apparently at night in dense fog, because some of the light then sort of reflected back from the fog and was quite sort of dazzling, and that was a security risk time. The RAF would actually send teams in about every 3 or 4 months to deliberately try and breach the security of the site, purely to keep the guards on their toes, and also to test the security was adequate for protecting nuclear weapons stored in the extremely top secret zone behind this wall here. There's several accounts in the log for the site, and I think there was only one occasion where a specialist trained personnel got over that wall but was immediately captured. Other personnel were caught on the outside, sort of trapped amongst the barbed wire, or in this area having set off a flare, being apprehended by the dog handlers, who were all armed with 9mm pistols as well. A little bit about the conservation of the site, because there has been extreme collaboration between the site owners and English Heritage and Historic England. One of the challenges was stabilising this wall. It's 1 kilometre long. Because of the iron rebar in the concrete, which was starting to rust, flake the concrete support posts, many of these panels were starting to fall out. A system for stabilising them was found by just creating these simple clips, which could be used in existing holes within the upright posts, and because of that we were able to put many of the fallen panels back safe and secure, to restore the wall to something as it would have looked like back in the 50s. So beyond this wall was the top secret part of the site, which is where the 25-foot, 10,000-pound bomb casings were stored, along with their TNT, and also the 57 storage pods, hutches, igloos as they were called, which had specialist lead-lined steel locked containers where the plutonium cores were stored, and also other materials such as cobalt used in the X-ray systems, and also polonium, which was part of the neutron initiator, which was a central component of the plutonium cores. So we're outside one of the nuclear storage hutches. There were 57 of these on site, but we suspect probably no more than 15 or 20 actually house nuclear material, as in the plutonium cores. They were spherical, about the size of a coconut or a large grapefruit. They were stored inside steel containers, and I'll show you some of those in a moment in one of our restored hutches, or igloos as they were called. They were designated their use by emblems, and this is called a trifoil. It's the
three-pronged, if you like, nuclear emblem against a yellow circular background. Interestingly, on some of the, or almost the majority of the igloos, you'll see now a yellow square with a blue star, often with a number 5. Not sure what that 5 means. Would have had some significance, I'm sure. But that would have showed that this was originally used for nuclear storage of the plutonium cores, and then at some point was probably repurposed for storing pyrotechnics, as in ammunition for the guards, and also the magnesium flares, thousands of which were placed on the ground in the sterile zone around the site to prevent unauthorized persons accessing the site. So this is quite nice. It shows both emblems. Some of them will show just one or the other. Up here, there's a stencil. Every year or 6 months, there was an electrical inspection. April 63 was the last time this hutch was inspected. And then from, I think, summer 63, the site started to be decommissioned. And that was because the technology changed and nuclear weapons started to be missile launched. So the airdrop facilities were no longer required, and they were decommissioned over about 2 to 3 years and then sold to my parents in 1966. They had very advanced technology for their day. I understand they had magnesium switches to prevent electrical sparks and shortcuts. And when you opened this door, an alarm would go off and a buzzer in the central control room. They would then sound a site alarm. Everybody in this area of the site had to stand still. There'd be few personnel, as it were. And the logic was that if the site had been involved in a security breach and someone was stealing a nuclear core, they would be seen running as quickly as they could in the opposite direction, and they'd be apprehended very quickly by the armed guards and dog patrols, particularly in the perimeter area over there. The person handling a nuclear core would obviously be carrying out their duties correctly and wouldn't be the person running around the site. So there were various protocols for handling materials, and security was always at the forefront. When we get to one of our restored hutches, I'll tell you a little bit about the rails and the process for actually managing the handling of the cores. So here we have one of the restored igloos or hutches. 6 of them were restored. They actually, with English Heritage, they investigated the colour of the paint used. There were 5 or 6 different colour schemes used. I don't think there was any attempt to camouflage them, because I think if a Russian spy plane had gone over, seen 57 suspicious looking nuclear storage hutches, the Russians would have been led to believe that we had a far greater nuclear capacity than we actually did, which was about probably 15 or so nuclear Blue Danube weapons stored on this site, with another 15 or 20 over at Foldingworth. So we probably implied we had 3 times more weapons than we actually did. When we opened the hutch, they would have had a pretty cutting edge combination system. There would have been a security system here as well. So when the door opened, a buzzer would have gone off in the command center, and they would have initiated a klaxon type alarm, which would have resonated over the whole site. The person handling the nuclear core would have put the nuclear core, would have been in a special cylinder, possibly lead lined, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on these things, and then placed in one of these highly secure cylinders. And then this would have had this enormously heavy counterweight, I can barely move it, and then locked with an extremely secure locking mechanism, locked shut. And everything in here was very high level security. And when the alarm went off, the only person allowed to move was the person handling the plutonium core. Anyone else, one of the very few specialists, high security level personnel, scientists working the site, would have to stand still whilst the klaxon was sounding. The logic to that being is, if this was being stolen by an enemy, they would presumably then leg it as quickly as possible towards trying to get over one of the fences, and the watchtower guards would have seen them, because imagine the site with no trees. Every watchtower would have seen us from this point, certainly the one over there, one over there. One over there might have just seen us. They would have sent a message to the guards, and armed guards and dog handlers on the ground, who would have come in and apprehended the person within seconds probably. The door over here is interesting, because in an attempt to preserve the emblems, English Heritage had a very clever system which they trialled, where they photographed the original door, capturing the original nuclear trifoil symbol. That then door was, the rusting metal panel was taken off and placed safely in the unit, so it would be preserved and protected from the weather. And what we see on the front of that door now is a photographic laminate. And I think it was a sort of cutting edge process in the day when they tried it. And that one's been very successful. So it's got an exact replica of the original emblem symbol, with the original safely secured in the igloo itself. Another interesting feature around the design of the site, because everything was very specific for its purpose, is in this part of the storage hutches, you've got these banks with very distinct pathways, and over there you've got railings. And the reason being is that that area of the site has naturally flat ground. This aspect has a naturally sloping ground, and the designers use that to their advantage. Reason being is a handler with a container and a nuclear core always had to keep the core away from other cores. If you came closer than about 6 to 8 feet, you would create a critical reaction between the two cores, and it'd be an extremely unpleasant demise, probably within about 2 weeks for the handler. So where the slope allowed it, they cut into the slope to create these banks. So handlers had to walk very much around other pods. Over there, to offset the risk, they created a very distinct guardrail system, so that people couldn't possibly take a shortcut walking too close with a nuclear core in their hand to a pod or igloo storing a nuclear core. So the building behind me is super interesting, although it looks fairly plain, because it was where the scientists inspected and did work on what were called the neutron initiators, or urchins. That was the very centre of the plutonium nuclear core, about the size of a marble. They were made up of various elements, but particularly polonium and beryllium. And I think polonium had a half-life of about 6 months. So every 6 months they had to be switched over, and new polonium and beryllium urchins placed in the plutonium cores. The wall around it is a blast wall, but it wasn't to stop a blast from within that building going outwards. It was to protect that building should one of the big TNT stores go up and that blast wave come in this direction. It was to minimise any impact on that building. During the restoration of this blast wall, there was a conversation around investing quite a lot of money in restoring it. And the decision was made to spend that money to restore it, because when you look at it in the context of Cold War era blast walls around a beryllium, polonium Urchin neutron initiator inspection module. It's probably, for its time and context, the only one in the world, so therefore it has a huge national historical significance. And it's nice to know that this now is hopefully safely preserved for generations to come to be aware of and look at. And we learn obviously from, you know, history, don't we? We don't learn from history, we tend to repeat ourselves a bit. So we've come to one of the two remaining bomb storage sheds or facilities on the site. We lost one to a fire in the mid-80s, but two are still here and have been extensively restored. What would have happened is the Pantechnicons, which is the term used for the types of transport vehicles, would have come underneath this canopy, canvas rollback top taken away. The hoist, which still works, believe it or not, 70 years later, would have come down, probably a big handling hook on the top of the Blue Danube bomb, lifted it up, lorry drives away. This could have been moved in, put down on top of what was called a motorized dolly. That would have then driven the bomb into the big storage facility, 55 meters long, 18, 20 meters wide, had central support posts down either side of a central gangway, and then bays for the Blue Danube bombs to be stored. I've heard mixed accounts of between 10 and 20 bombs being stored in each facility. Now, we've recognised that there were probably never more than 15, 20 bombs ever on the site, even though we had capacity for 57. And what they did was split the bombs over the 3 storage sheds. And that was a little bit of a insurance policy. If there were some event and the TNT in one unit went off, we'd still have 2/3 of the bomb stored in the other units. This building was designed so if there was an internal explosion, the walls weren't particularly strong. The blast would have gone outwards and been dissipated into these massive surrounding banks and blast walls, which totally encapsulated each of the storage warehouses. And that prevented any blast dominoing across the whole site and decimating the whole site. So it was a very clever design, really, considering that the whole site was constructed in probably about 2 years, with some extra touches like the enhanced watchtowers put up to 4 years into the use of the site. £2.5 million, £2.5 million to build this site, 53, 54, 55, and £1 million per bomb. So a massive financial investment, considering it only had 8 years of use. So we'll have a quick look in here. The generators for the site, for these units, were in these big areas here, all the electrics, the generators. There was very specific humidity and temperature controls required for the storage of the TNT, which was within the bomb casings, because obviously if it got damp or contaminated in any way with the wrong level of moisture or dampness, that would have compromised the function of the bomb. So very specific, very high cutting technology for its day. We come into the site now, you get a little bit of a vibe for it. Original doors. It's fairly gloomy with the doors closed. The internal walls would not have been here. These internal walls were constructed with the doors into smaller units by my parents in the mid to late 60s for the mushroom growing business. The original use of this internal space would have been open plan, and we do have a couple of photos which Dan and Sophie can perhaps show a bit later. But whatever time of year you come in here, it's almost a constant temperature. So if it's a blisteringly hot outside, it'll still be this nice cool temperature. And if it's cold outside, it'll feel a little bit warmer. One of the final buildings to show you is this building here. This was an inspection building for the whole Blue Danube bomb casings. They would come in a little slip road just over in that direction behind the blast wall here into the building via those big original steel doors. There was an air vacuum in there for some reason where they could also x-ray the bombs and the bomb casing to look for any cracks or internal damage on the bombs. Hence the use of cobalt and storage of cobalt on the site, which I believe was part of the x-ray process. And then once the bombs had been inspected, they'd go out via matching bomb doors at the end of this building and then out to the inner relief road on the opposite side of this building. So everything would have had a very much a fluid, I believe, one-way process in the way the bombs were stored, handled, maintained and managed.
So Richard, we've come to the end of this amazing tour. We just wanted to really talk about the future of the site itself. So
it is a fully operational industrial estate. So its primary function is a commercial business. That enables us to reinvest monies from that enterprise back into the maintenance of the site, which is really an ongoing process, a bit like painting the fourth bridge, I think is the expression, trying to keep the grounds in good order and also the buildings in good order and preserving them for future posterity. We're here on the first platform of one of our watchtowers. We had this restored and the searchlights on this even work, believe it or not. This would have been looking down one of the strips of the sterile zone. The site itself, I can offer access to the site. It's been a great pleasure to host you, Sophie, today, Dan. But we have to do it through an organised arrangement. So if there are any societies, historical societies that want to contact me to organise a tour, I can do tours between about 6 to 20 people. If individuals wanted to come, I could organise a day sometime later in the summer, and perhaps the first sort of 15, 20 people to book on that can have access. Because it is an industrial estate, obviously from an operational point of view, it is a permission only on the site, I'm afraid, but has to be so because of security and site health and safety. But yeah, if people are interested, then I can be contacted. If people look for Gorse, G-O-R-S-E, Industrial Estate, we have a website, and my contact details for myself, Richard Eldred, are on that website.
2 more questions, mate, before we leave. Bit of a sort of funny ones, but we'll go for it. What's your funniest memory of the site?
Well, there are some good stories, but one of the memories I like, and I sort of keep forgetting about it, but being on the platform of this watchtower now, is when I was young, I used to have one of the Action Man toys, and I was very thrilled when I got the one which had a parachute, and I knew exactly the place to launch that from. So I used to come up here with my parents as a youngster, go up to the highest platform I was allowed on, and then hurl the Action Man off and watch with amazement as it floated down to the ground. So that's one of that memory always makes me smile, because it was well over 50 years ago, but it seems like yesterday.
And the final question before we go, mate. What's your favourite part of the site, and for what reason?
I think from a Cold War structure point of view, it's got to be the watchtowers. I think they're so unique, so amazing, and yeah, they never cease to make me smile coming up the watchtowers. What I also like about the site is the way that outside of the buildings themselves, the surrounding ground is now virtually a nature reserve. It's a great place for plants and birds, and walking around the site's a very meditative experience. And I was just saying to Dan, I call it my Zen zone when I go for a walk around. So I'd say just the nature side, the flora and the fauna of the site, great for birds, great for plants. Yeah, really nice.
Thank you so much, mate. It's
Great
been an
pleasure.
absolute pleasure, and hopefully we've done a great job of documenting it. And
Fantastic.
thank you, long may this site and your hard work and your maintenance may continue.
Yeah. Well, thank you to you and Sophie for your interest, and I'm glad you had a good visit.
Take care, mate.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.